couple words of greeting to your wonderful leadership there in the congregation, lay and ordained. You're doing it right. You're a really special place, and I hope you cherish that and appreciate that. I love all of your clergy, Reverend Venervine, and my Baltimore sister, Reverend Jones, and my new friend, Reverend Palmisano, my buddy. We need to get a little personal phone time and Zoom time. I'm really looking forward to rapping with you. And over the years, I've known other folks who've worshiped with you and connected with you. Again, thank you for this really kind, generous invitation. You're sort of staying for overtime in church. One of the, I grew up in what people broadly would describe as the Black church. And church Sundays for me were sort of getting up early, getting to church at like 9 for Sunday school, and then staying for like a 3-hour service, and then staying for like brunch lunch at church, and then some type of activity after that. And so, after you've stacked up like 5 or 6 hours at church, going home, and that's hard on a kid, but didn't have much choice. And then I kind of came to the Episcopal church, and it's in and out. It's like a solid hour, and the congregation often has reminders for preachers and clergy to kind of keep it short, get to the point, because we got stuff to do. And so I'm grateful for that. I bring that up because the fact that you're staying for overtime is not very Episcopalian of you, but it is very generous of you. And so it means a lot that you've decided to have bonus church, extra time to contemplate these things. This morning, I promise we'll get you out of here in time for lunch, and in time to get to the grocery store before this pending storm, I think, is coming in a couple hours. I wanted to share, if it's okay, a little bit of my journey and some things I've been thinking about recently, and kind of frame it with some passages from a new book that I just was published a couple months ago. I'm originally from Baltimore, and made my way here to Philadelphia. And my first semester in college up here, I remember seeing someone sleeping outside with a blanket over one of those heat grates downtown, where the kind of like sort of steam rises up from the sidewalk to stay warm. And I remember just being so struck by the kind of societal failure that we had of having a fellow human being sleeping outside. And the causes of homelessness are super complex and wide ranging, and the things that sort of keep people in homelessness are very complicated too. But I remember just being very struck as a young person seeing that. And one of the great questions of my life has been, what is our responsibility to others who are suffering, particularly in moments where it ain't easy for us ourselves? So it's particularly in a moment like the age of COVID, where all of us in some ways are in kind of survival mode, and all of us are sort of just trying to make it day to day and take care of us and the people in our circles. What's our responsibility to the people downtown in Philly right now? For all of us who are kind of up here, if we could think hierarchically, what's our responsibility to those on the bottom? And that's the name of, I'm sorry to turn this into a commercial. I don't mean to, do that, but this, the recent book that I wrote, it's called The Bottom, a Theopoetic of the Streets. If you recognize this statue, it's actually from the Episcopal Cathedral downtown in West Philly, where I'm kind of one of the assisting clergy down there. And it's an image of, it's a statue of portraying Jesus as a beggar. So I wanted to read from the preface here and share a little bit about my journey. So we'll see where the Spirit leads us today. Baltimore in the 1970s and 1980s, like the Baltimore of Freddie Gray, demanded that young Black men be brave every day. And I learned that courage fighting on the streets of the mid-Atlantic port town where I was born and raised. It was under the weeping willow tree that stood somberly in front of my apartment building that I had my first street fight. I wasn't alone. At my side were battle-tested warriors who came to help me fight off these bad guys who had invaded our neighborhood. Today, I find myself frustrated when individuals are characterized as bad guys or evil. Humans are complex, and we all have a story. We all have a reason for doing what we do. But these were legit bad guys. Villains who came to my hood with one mission: the total destruction of our planet. I sprung out my door and I dove behind the tree that served as our base of operations. What these invaders did not know was that I have the power of flight. That, along with my invisibility, my kinetic energy blast, and the power to read minds, it made me a formidable foe for any adversary intent on doing us harm. I sent my boy T'Challa the Black Panther to move in first and get some recon on the enemy. Storm created a cloud cover over us. Cyborg attacked and hacked into their computer systems to slow them down. Finally, I would move in and rescue my mom from the evil alien Klansmen trying to enslave Black folks again. And just as I stood face to face with their powerful Grand Wizard, I heard from the front door of my building, "Poopy, dinner." My mom's voice calls me back to our dinner table and back to reality. It was when fighting racist supervillain aliens that I first learned courage. Or to be more specific, it was in my imagination that I first learned courage. More than 30 years later, I recognized the irony in my retreating to the worlds that I created in my mind. These imaginary courageous journeys were a survival tactic, a mental escape from the real battles my 8-year-old self was too scared to engage. My mom was dying. My father had just lost his job due to racism in his professional field, and it was all way too much for me. From age 8 through my mother's death when I was 11, and even well into my teen years when my father would also pass, I used the one real superpower that I had: my imagination. When the reality of my life became unbearable, I easily jumped to a world where it was safer, where the pain and grief of loss and racism could be escaped. Or maybe it was my imagination. I had the courage and the tools to work for healing and to fight back there. I miss those adventures. I still have old notebooks where I wrote up my dreamed up characters and described their powers, even sketching them. I saved the world hundreds of times. Thank you. You're welcome, by the way. As an adult and as a father, I enjoy writing at my breakfast table as it allows me to look out upon our backyard and see my daughters playing outside. Sometimes they're practicing soccer, sometimes they're just singing and dancing, but occasionally I see them running around with and speaking to others that only their eyes can see. Their adventures sound more like Nancy Drew mysteries or Harry Potter tales because they actually read things besides comic books, unlike their dad in his youth. And I smile because imagination lives on. This is the message I try to pass on to young activists. Speaking out against oppression and fearful hatred is key. Critical refusal in the face of injustice is essential. But we must have the ability to imagine something different and imagine ourselves working to build that something different. We draw from the prophetic aspects of our religious traditions, and rightly so. But we must also draw from the creation narratives of our faiths as well. I've long been drawn to the activism in the 1960s in the US with names like Martin King, Ella Baker, Stokely Carmichael, Bayard Rustin, Cesar Chavez, and Dolores Huerta. Those names are taught to me as a kid, and they've walked with me in my cloud of witnesses ever since. Through them and other activists, I learned of the phrase, power to the people. As a child, I might have amended that to say, superpower to the people, as I flew around sad trees trying to uplift the world. But while in the US we spoke of power to the people, at the same time in France, a popular phrase of activists and artists was l'imagination au pouvoir, power to the imagination. It's true. There's so much power in our imaginations. It's there that I learned to be brave, and it's there that I believe we can draw plans to bravely build something new around poverty and homelessness. You know, my kids tease me because I'm a comic book nerd, and like I've always been like one of those sci-fi guys, Lord of the Rings and Star Wars and all that kind of stuff. And there is an escape aspect to it, but there's a challenge in it too. A challenge to be creative. And I think the trap of life for me and for us right now, I think, is to just survive and kind of make it day to day and sort of just exist. Or a little better than that, to sort of call out what's wrong and resist. I think that's deeply important in so many ways. I think that's one of the things that we're very good at in the US, protesting things that are broken and wrong and resisting bad things. But it's a lot harder to imagine and to answer the question, what do we want? What do we want to see? And to sort of imagine that, and then to put our hands to it and build that. And I think that's true with the big questions like poverty and homelessness and racism and violence. I think it's true in some of our interpersonal relationships. It's certainly a lot easier to kind of call out what we don't like, the things that our loved ones do. It's a lot harder to articulate what we want and to envision what this could be in a couple of years. In some sense, that's what I've tried to kind of play around with in the book, and it's what I try to kind of play around with in my life. One of the gifts of chaplaincy. So, I journeyed from Baltimore. I came to Philly for college. I went to seminary in Boston and came back down here and worked in hospitals and hospice chaplaincy, as Reverend Michael so kindly alluded to. And now I work as Penn's chaplain and vice president. And so much of the work is like putting out fires and responding to crises, be it a student coming in who doesn't know what they're going to major in, or their parents are getting on their nerves, or or they don't believe in God anymore. That's heavy. Or they have a question like, how did Noah get all those animals on that boat? And or the person who comes from a pretty homogenous kind of conservative Christian background, whose roommate is a gay Hindu man who's amazing, who's awesome. And it challenges their question of like, is that guy getting into heaven with me? So part of chaplaincy is sort of being present, journeying with them there. But one of the other great gifts I love about chaplaincy is imagining what this kid could be. Sort of wide-eyed 18-year-old who was prom king and captain of her field hockey team and all that, and seeing what they might be and helping them get there and nudging them toward it, or particularly when students kind of mess up, and helping them see a better version of themselves. In a lot of ways, that's been the story of my life, is sort of people showing me grace and helping me see the best version of myself that I could be. One of the stories of my life that has become something I like to share with students was I went to Penn as an undergrad. I haven't left. I tell my buddies from undergrad that they all got off the island, like that old TV show Lost. They all got off the island and sort of left me there, and they never came back to rescue me. Anyway, one of the stories that I share was my junior year. I actually got kicked out of Penn. So I came to the university and was doing all right, but I think the grief of losing both my folks kind of caught up with me, and I sort of tried to handle that by drinking. Kind of drowned away my pain. And you drink too much in school and you end up not going to class, and you don't go to class and you don't get good grades, and you don't get okay grades, and you end up not being in the school anymore. And so I got that warning letter, and then that sort of, I still have this letter somewhere, the very painful letter asking me to leave Penn. And my predecessor, the then chaplain, whose name is William Gibson, kind of called me into his office and pulled some other administrators in. And after kicking me in my butt benevolently, made some calls on my behalf and loved me when I was at the bottom of my life. Grief, heartbreak, anxiety, addiction. They came in and kind of got in it with me. And I ended up only missing a summer of school, and they got me back in. And got me in AA and in counseling. I've been in recovery for, almost 20 something years now. And I graduated. And I think they saw something that I could be. In so many ways, this is what I try to do with students now. But more importantly, I think it's something that we are all called to do as Christians now, as humans now. The story that sort of resonates most with me in Scripture, besides sort of Christ dying for our sins and loving us, is this notion of God calling individuals to go down with God's people and help them out. The book talks about this kind of Moses motif. I describe it as a mosaic book. And if you think about the story of Moses, Moses who, born Hebrew, and because of kind of the oppression there of the Egyptians, his mother gives him up into the little boat thing that floats down the River Nile, and Pharaoh's daughter rescues Moses, renames Moses, and raises Moses in Pharaoh's palace. And Moses is raised as like a prince of Egypt, like the great cartoon movie. Up here on this hill in Pharaoh's palace. And down here, Hebrews are sort of feeling the lash of the whip of slavery and the pain of being oppressed and killed at will and being marginalized. And Moses comes down to be with God's people. It literally goes out to the margins of Midian, and then comes back on behalf of the God of the universe to fight for those on the bottom. I think if we can think about that as a calling on all of our lives, not just the Moseses of the world, not just Joseph, not just the disciples, not just Martin Luther King or Ella Baker, not just sort of like these superheroes, but I think this is the call of all of us to help folks who are on the bottom, be it people sleeping on heat grates downtown, be it marginalized populations who are being othered and hated and persecuted and kicked out of our country and beat up and having their places of worship burned down, or having their rights taken from them, rights to love who they want to love and go where they're like. Hey, if we can think about that as a call for all of us to love those on the bottom and on the margins, I think maybe we could do the Christian thing a little. I think that's doing the Christian thing. I'd like to read another passage from the book that talks about this notion of kind of burning bushes. Because I think one of the challenges, though, is, okay, I'm open, God, to going to the bottom, but where do I go? To whom? I've always been enchanted by lines that are gray. Sfumato, blurred borders between the now and the not yet. That Italian word sfumato. If anyone read the biography about Leonardo da Vinci, the recent one, it talks about, this is a technique that the painter, that the artist, the genius Leonardo da Vinci used to sort of create more lifelike portraits. So if you think about the Mona Lisa, a portrait of kind of a woman there and just stuff in the background here. Sfumato is where you kind of blur the line between the kind of main subject and the things in the background. So it's literally a painting technique. So rather than like a crisp line here and then seeing the wall behind me, you use your technique, you use your brush to kind of blur it, and then it looks more realistic. It looks more the way that we actually see things in real life. So this notion of sfumato is blurring things in the name of seeing things more clearly. I've always been enchanted by lines that are gray. Sfumato, blurred borders between the now and the not yet, the real and the surreal, the hyperreal and the imagined. Some realities are self-constructed, presenting what we want others to see. The author, Susan Howatch, calls these glittering images. If I could just pause for another second. My favorite form of communication is tangent. So like, I apologize for that, but here's another tangent. My favorite author is this woman named Susan Howatch. If you're looking for something to read, she is a queen. I see some heads nodding right now. She is a boss. She is a queen. And she wrote this. She writes a lot of great books, but a series called the Church of England series. And so I think to folks on this call, her work will really resonate. It's set in England and kind of ranges from, I think, World War I to sort of now, and focuses on several different characters. Her first book that grabbed my heart was called Glittering Images. They're kind of mysteries. They're sort of like spiritual. There's a lot of psychology in there. But if you need something to read over the winter, read all of Susan Howatch's Church of England series. And if you can read them in order, they are page turners. And that was an unpaid commercial, Susan Howatch. Okay. Some realities are projected onto others, disallowing them to be free. My father called this being Black in America. And some realities are not yet. Our children will call that home. What follows in this text is a true story, or it could be, or it will be. I write it in dust on the ground, free, like liberated poetry, and I give it all away, like fire giving warmth, fire giving light, fire burning a palace to the ground. Everyone has a burning bush moment, yet very few of us pause, remove our sandals, and look into the fire. Fewer still listen to the call coming from within the miracle. And it is the rare individual who overcomes themselves and actually answers it. The desert journey from enkindled calling to liberating plagues must be trod very carefully while dancing freely. My feet have walked this path, burned from the sand, bloody from the stones, migrated from careless personal ascent to careful anonymous descent. I write this story in song, graffiti, in poem, in prayer. I write it in dust on the ground, free like liberated poetry, and I give it all away, that you may find the flame in your own life and follow its call, that you will go out under the humble veil of anonymity and shake down the walls of whatever Egypt you're living in, that you can help people and perhaps yourself cross into freedom in small or big ways and dance by the sea. You know, I originally, the title of the book before the publisher came in was kind of heavy-handed with it. Originally, the book was called Descent, Dissent, D-I-S-S-E-N-T, descent, as in the sort of dissenting decision, and then descent, as in going down. And again, I think that has been one of the challenges for many of us right now. So much of the world, if I can sort of make that broad stroke, is about ascending, be it climbing in our careers or climbing wealth-wise or reputation-wise, gaining power, working our way vocationally up through sort of church ranks. And yet, I think the Christian message is the opposite. Again, if one thinks of heaven up there, Jesus coming down to be with us. I mean, we're gonna be reminded of this story later this season as we walk into Lent and then Holy Week. You know, instead of riding into Jerusalem as a conquering king on the back of a horse with an army, Jesus rides in on a donkey with like a ragtag bunch of like fishermen and like tax collectors and people not holding swords but like palms. And he doesn't go in to take over the throne. He goes in to die on a cross. And Jesus isn't born, as we just celebrating Christmas, in Rome or Jerusalem and with sort of, huge celebration. You know the story. Out there in the margins, Bethlehem, then Egypt, then Nazareth. Can anything good come from that? You know the deal. Again, I think this is part of the challenge as Christians. And to speak personally, one of the challenges for me, because I'm human too, and I have kids, and I want my kids to have nice things, and I have an ego, and it's nice to sort of be appreciated and to see my name in print and whatever. But it's, as the author of Ecclesiastes would say, it's vanity, or it's meaningless, or I can't take any of that stuff with you, whatever. But you know what's eternal and lasting? Souls. If we can come down and be with others and point them toward love, then I think we're doing it right. That's what our God has done for us. That's what I hope to do for others. If I could speak super recently, I think it's easier to think of like helping and loving those on the bottom who are marginalized and suffering and going through it. Jesus makes this even harder for us, though. This notion of loving our enemies, loving those who are kind of ugly right now. I make no presumptions about the political leanings or persuasions of anyone on the call or of your church. I think if you're like many other churches on the main line, it's probably a beautiful mix in good times where people can be in dialogue and challenge each other and kind of roll their eyes but not throw punches. It's been hard for me recently to imagine showing grace and loving the ugliest of the other side. I mean, the deep hurt and resentment in me after the assault on the Capitol a few weeks ago. And that was about so much more than not believing the outcome of the election. There were Confederate flags and Nazi symbols in there and white supremacist symbols in there. And as a Black man from Baltimore, this call of Jesus to try to show compassion to them, who in many ways in my eyes are on the bottom. Boy, that's hard. Easy for me to love a kid who's struggling in college. That was me. Easy for me to love somebody going through poverty. That was me in some ways too. Or someone who's a racial minority or a religious minority. I can get there. Someone who's a bigot, or who I perceive as being there, or who just is not moving in truth. Boy, I have all these conditions in my mind. Yeah, first, like, look, if they can apologize and they need to be held accountable after that, and then like if they can sort of eat it and kind of own it and then come on the humble, if they initiate and say they're sorry, then like, okay, then we can have a conversation. And accountability is real. Look, you break a law, Jack, we kind of need accountability there. You can't just be rolling up in the Capitol, blowing up stuff. Like, that's real. But I see Jesus kind of getting in my face a little bit, like, what conditions did I give you before I came down to love you on the bottom? Chaz, did you repent before I endeavored to save you? Did you apologize to me? There's a role of repentance in Christianity, of course. But I'm feeling this hard charge, and this is a real-time struggle. I'm not acting like I've done it. I've not landed this plane. I am not, driving around different districts here that voted differently than I did. I'm not there yet. But this is the burning bush in front of me right now. And I think in front of a lot of us, regardless of where you are politically, this notion to go to the whatever your bottom is, it's hard. But the good news is there's a promised land on the other side of it. I'll pause there, and I'd love to have a little conversation with you before I let you get some lunch. If there's any questions or thoughts or comments, I'd love to have a little back and forth with you. And thanks so much.
Thank you, Chaz. Yeah, if anyone feels so called, please just unmute yourself or even type something into the chat. It'd be great.
Can I ask a question? Hi, Chaz.
Hey, my friend, it's good to see you. I didn't know you were on this call. I didn't see you. That's awesome.
I'm struggling like you are, except it's within my family of origin. And so, I guess with a lot of the differences, politically, etc., as we struggle, we don't have to necessarily come into dialogue or face to face with maybe neighbors or colleagues or anything like that, maybe until we've processed it a little bit better or we're ready to. But when it's immediate family, it's just so painful. And I'm just wondering if you have any counseling to provide to maintain those loving relationships and yet to try to stand up for what you believe is truth and justice. I know Jesus said, something to the effect of his coming would divide families. And I don't know if this is what that was referring to, but just want to know your thoughts on that. Thanks, Chaz.
Thanks, Mia, for that good, hard question. I don't have a great answer, but I just heard this recently where someone, the answer they gave was love is the best way. Or to kind of reference one of my favorite saints. When I was in seminary, I worked in the campus bookstore, and we sold books, but like you can't make a lot of money just selling books. So we had all these kind of like trinkets and like stuff, and they sold these little like quote things. And one was by a saint named Teresa of Avila, who said, her quote was, "It's not a matter of doing much or thinking much, but do whatever most kindles love in you." And I've used that in a number of contexts in my life to figure out what to do vocationally, and in the moment, do whatever most kindles love in you, as opposed to what is cathartic for me, or what avenges me, or protects me, or being led by fear and self-preservation, doing what kindles love in me. That said, I would never want someone to walk into a room and get beat up necessarily, literally or sort of emotionally. Nor do I think one rushes a conversation that's not ready to be had. I think this is a lesson I've learned with my spouse of like, I'm let's talk it through. Let's not go to bed angry. But my spouse is more, sometimes needs a beat to think about it, or like a day to think about it. And if I kind of chase them, like, we need to talk about this right now, it's like, it's not going to work. And it's in fact going to be worse. And it's going to delay the reconciliation like a week. Sometimes it's okay to give room until it's time. But making sure love is the compass. I think a very practical answer, though, I would give would be, one thing I know I can do is pray specifically for them. And not a like, help them see how bad they are, God. Not necessarily that sort of prayer, which is the way my prayers often start, but to pray that they would be blessed. I'll again, the petty in me, when I saw, I'll be very frank, former President Trump and Melania, his wife, walking, and to see her pull her hand away, there's a lot of me that was like, that's what he gets. Good. I hope she leaves his behind, and I hope Barron is nasty to him, and I hope that he gets sued and lose all, like that's just petty and angry and mad me. What if I prayed for that marriage? That's profound. It's really hard for me to pray good things for that man, who I think has done so much cruelty and whatever. What about our extended family? Praying for their health, for their happiness, for revelation and clarity, and for reconciliation. Like, can you get back to wanting it to work? Now, there is a lot more to say. I don't think you normalize hate. That's a really big deal. Like, as much as I want to reconcile with people who are on the other side of these issues, I don't want to sort of act like having a Confederate flag is okay, or being an anti-Semite is okay. I don't want to normalize that ever. And then I don't want to unify with that. But I want to win that person. And I would love for them to, whatever's broken over there, to heal. And I can pray about that, as opposed to wishing damnation and pain on my enemies. I can at least pray. And the last thing is, I think, making sure I don't burn the bridge. You know, again, we may not be able to talk for a while. They may not want to talk either. But one thing I can do is not burn the bridge, and to use that, I mean, it's such a violent illustration, but to at least leave a light on it, a little bit of hope that maybe someday we can be better. So these are sort of really charged times. We're having political debate in the midst of a generational pandemic that has killed 400,000 people in our country, 1 million around the world. Like, working it out right now doesn't seem super easy. But I've seen greater divides come together. And so maybe in the upcoming years, holding out hope that maybe we can be friends again, or be cousins like we used to be, or in-laws like we once were. I don't want to say you're dead to me. And again, not to sound too pious, but Christ has never done that to anyone here. As bad as we've been, fully walking away and disrespecting and not representing, I feel like Christ has never burned the bridge to me. I don't know. You're catching me on a hopeful day. Like, a couple days ago, I was literally like, he's dead to me. Like, I can't. So like, I think it's continuing to struggle and hold out hope. Sorry to filibuster with that answer. Sorry about that.
Thank you, Chaz. That was helpful.
Chaz, I'm seeing a message here from Jim earlier in the chat, asking you how, if in some ways the COVID pandemic has provided some of us, those of us rather, not on the bottom, an easy way out of not moving out of our comfort, towards helping or serving or understanding others.
It's a real point, Jim. I think that the cliche "out of sight, out of mind" is real. I mean, like, pretty much almost everyone in our world is out of sight, aside from the people who vary in our inner circle, in our kind of COVID bubbles, and maybe the people we see in the Zooms we're connected to. But there's a reason why giving to organizations like Project Home and Bethesda Project and Covenant House, other sort of nonprofits downtown has gone down. Part of it is just the real financial struggle in the world right now, the kind of financial pandemic many of us are, financial catastrophe many of us are in. But also, we're just not seeing people. You know, if I'm not going to the art museum, it's hard to imagine giving to the art museum. If I'm not going to an event, it's hard to even think about that. If I'm not seeing individuals struggle, it's hard to even pray about them, because I just don't think about it. You're absolutely right. It's out of sight, out of mind. But I think so much of our calling is to stop and turn and look. I mean, again, this is a funny detail. Moses didn't have to stop at the burning bush. Moses is doing his job, kind of taking care of the sheep, of Jethro's sheep, married, got kids, kind of doing his thing. And like, it could have been, that's weird, burning bush, not consumed, and kind of kept it moving. But Moses stops to see. We all kind of need to stop and see and look.
Chaz, I have another question here that came to me directly in the chat. More on a practical side, if that would even be the right word, is what does it look like really? How can we at the top reach out to the bottom? What is that kind of the language I was given one time from a spiritual director was really the downward mobility of the gospel. How do we actually enact that?
Love that phrase, the downward mobility of the gospel. To be mobile and go. I mean, that's ridiculous to say that, and like most of us are sort of told to stay.
About the upward mobility of the gospel. I mean, your imagery has been about going down, which presumes that we're all up. There's a kind of sociological fabric work that, or maybe economic work, but isn't that sometimes the real need? Those that have everything that they need, somehow we have to wake up to minister. Do you have a to help us? There were the Zacchaeus too, Jesus minister, or the circle, and one of whom was of Herod's. There's a certain way we can get categories confused, I think.
John, my apologies, man. My Wi-Fi shook up for a second there. Could you share briefly again?
Oh,
sorry to make you repeat all that. Dude, my Wi-Fi.
Yeah. All right. No, just reflecting on that. You've been hopeful in the area of going down, and so often the mainline we think in terms of going because there's something down there. But the minister will sometimes ask us to get up. Because up and down, in a sense, is social sort of display. But the brokenness, neediness, and everything is respect of economic needs. And it's easy for me to imagine all downward. Sometimes I think I receive a call upward, but how can you help us there? And first, have I made my third?
It's a cool question, and I'm sorry to make you do it twice. So thank you for sharing again. You know, your question says a lot about a couple things. One, how problematic it is to even think of the world as kind of up and down, this sort of hierarchical thing. And a part of, I think, the gift of Christ too is blowing up that whole way of seeing things. And that there's some of us up here and there's some folks down there. And there's something very unhealthy and dangerous about that. That is, in many ways, we've inherited from kind of old European society of kind of monarchy and aristocracy, like all of that, or different caste kind of setups. And Jesus kind of comes and blows that up and shows the tension of being both king and, homeless at the same time, of being winner, conqueror, and loser conquered at the same time. And maybe a part of our effort is to really push back on that of us and down there. And yet there is this sort of spiritual aspect of going down, but also kind of coming up to being something more, and at best bringing others up with us. There's an illustration in my life that I often think about. So before my dad died, Baltimore is on the water, and we were on a friend's boat, and I don't want that to sort of seem like a yachting culture. It like Baltimore is very much like you just go out and fish and get crabs, and that's just kind of a part of it. So we were there at this little marina, and I must have been 3, 4, 5, and I'm stepping onto. I'm trying to walk from the pier to the boat, and I step over and I fall, and I miss the boat, and I kind of fall down into the water, which may have been 4 or 5 feet deep. It wasn't sort of but for a little person, it was pretty. And my dad sort of reaches down into the water and plunges his hand and kind of grabs me and pulls me up. And, you know, kind of puts me on the thing and keeps it moving like nothing happened, like I almost didn't drown right there. When I think of coming up, I don't think it's necessarily for our own spiritual ascension. I know you're not saying this. I don't think it's so much for our own kind of coming up out of the mud of addiction, of distance from God. I think it's coming up to bring others with us. This notion of kind of pulling as we climb kind of thing. And so if we are trying to go up, and maybe that is a part of the goal, we have to sort of rescue and bring others up to God too. We got time for like one more or so, Michael?
Yeah, we have a question here in the chat. Another one in reference to what you mentioned about Susan Howatch, and essentially how she tackles questions about understanding God's presence and grace in our lives. And the question says, she particularly looks at academic and theological philosophies, mostly by white guys, and how to apply these to the messy realities of human experience. And so really the question is, what are your thoughts about the intellectual contemplation of God and Christ versus the way that maybe these lessons play themselves out or are applied in the joys and pains and sorrows of really embodied life?
What's the charge in the Old Testament and in Christ's in the gospel? Sort of love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, which is hard to sort of love with all of that. And I think I get that with my heart, love God with all my heart. And I suppose physically kind of loving God with my strength and my physical resources, soul, whatever that means. But this mind is kind of a harder one. Loving, worshiping, glorifying God with our minds. When I was finishing seminary, a couple of my teachers who I loved, they were trying to encourage me to kind of go pursue doctoral work. And I remember my first response was like, like I want to, this is such a snotty thing to say. Like, I want to actually do something with my faith. I want to actually like be about something rather than, and I'm saying this to two professors who are like doctors who were like just taught me for 3 years. I'm like, I actually want to do something with my degree. Like, and like, this is such a snot. And like, they were gracious about the whole thing, but their pushback was like, there's a way to worship God with study and pushing in deeper. Now, everything has a shadow side. I think there's sort of ways of kind of sort of shrinking God by sort of thinking we can master it by intellectual pursuit and study, and not keeping the humble understanding that God is bigger than even our grandest thoughts, and no human language can come close to touching the divine. At the same time, I think we are called to wrestle with what does God want us to do in certain situations, and to attempt to answer the question, what does this mean? So to me, this is a worthy pursuit. It is a humbling pursuit. At the end of the book of Job, another tangent, after Job's trying to figure out all the suffering, maybe this is sort of apt for the moment we're in, Job who lost everything. And Job's friends are trying to explain why Job's kids have died and why he lost all of his wealth, and he's got his body's falling apart, and Job was just suffering, and chapter after chapter after chapter, they're trying to explain it. And then Job finally musters the courage and kind of comes at God like, why? And God's response to Job, God of the universe, comes down and speaks to this one human and says, who is this who darkens my counsel with words without knowledge? Who's this who darkens my counsel with words without knowledge? This, to me, I think is this tension around theological pursuit. of needing to wrestle with why is this happening? God, why are we in the midst of this pandemic? And why are we having such tension politically and racial tension? And why are Black people getting killed by cops? And why is gun violence on the like, and what do you want me to do as a Christian? And what about my Muslim and Jewish neighbors? And like wrestling with these questions. At the same time, there's this tension of, you may not get an answer, human, but here's your answer. I'm here with you. God's answer to Job isn't, let me tell you what happened. Like, the devil came up here and had this like bet kind of thing. And like, we said, and generations will understand the story. And like, it wasn't that answer. The answer was, you don't know what you're talking about, but I'm here. This, I think, is one of the gifts of kind of the mind, and drawing closer to God with our minds. And ultimately, I think I'll land the plane there. I hope you remember this too. God's in all of this with us. All of us at the top, the bottom, however we look at it, in the suburbs, in West Philly, as babies, in middle age, in our mature years, God's with us in all of it. It may not make sense, but you're loved. I so appreciate you all. If you remember us in your prayers, please pray for Penn. We got a bunch of college kids trying to navigate COVID, and college kids are gross. So please keep us in your prayers. And if I could ever be of service, please don't hesitate.
Thank you, Chaz. Thank you for being here with us this morning. And before I invite everyone to maybe give you a round of applause and to say thanks, I will give you a bit of an advertisement here for your book. Chaz just actually told me this week he would defer the honorarium for the adult forum that we normally give our speakers. And so I purchased a number of his books. And if you would like to pick one up, please just send me an email and I'll set one aside for you. I have several in my office right now. Just send me an email, not in the chat here. It'll be a lot easier for me. And so that's a gift from Chaz to you all for participating. So again, Chaz, thank you so much for being with us. Hope to have you back sometime. And if anyone else would, offer up some round of applause and thanks, please feel free to unmute yourself before we send them off.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that.
Thank you.
Thank you so very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Be safe today. Blessings, everyone.